Welcome to Indian Genes, the podcast that explores the intersections of science, culture, and the human mind. Today, we have an exclusive episode that will take you deep into the realm of the brain's most fascinating and mysterious capabilities. Our guest is a true pioneer in the world of cognitive and behavioral neurology. He is rewriting how we understand the imagination and the human mind. Professor Adam Zeman, trained at Oxford University Medical School, has worked across some of the UK's most prestigious institutions, including Queen Square in London and Cambridge's Addenbrooke's Hospital. He's held the esteemed role of Professor of Cognitive and Behavioral Neurology at the University of Exeter Medical School. But his work doesn't stop there. Professor Zeman's new book, The Shape of Things Unseen, is a fascinating journey through our imagination, from REM sleep to delusions, from visual hallucinations to the creative power of the brain. He explores how our imagination isn't just a byproduct of thought, but is central to who we are and how we connect with one another. And today, right here on Indian Genes, Professor Zeman is going to share his insights, groundbreaking research, and his fascinating perspective on the human mind. So, sit back, relax, and get ready for an enlightening and exclusive exploration of the mind with one of the world's foremost experts in cognitive neurology. This is an Indian Genes exclusive, India's #1 science podcast.
So, Adam, from everyone here in India and Indian Genes, a very, very warm welcome to you. And thank you so much for spending time to speak to us here. In fact, I've read a couple of your books. I think we will talk about that a little bit later. But before we get there, Adam, why don't you say hello to all our listeners and tell us a little bit more about yourself for people who have probably not read your books or are getting interested in what you are putting out there.
Okay, so greetings to you all. My trade is as a neurologist. I've spent my working life as a neurologist, focusing mainly on cognitive neurology. So that's the area of neurology that has to do with disorders of the brain that affect cognition, for example, memory, language, and recently my interest has been particularly in imagery. I came into neurology by a slightly roundabout route. So I was a confused teenager. I wasn't really sure what to do at university, and I was frustrated by the need to choose between the humanities and the sciences. And I ended up doing a degree in philosophy and psychology initially, which I loved. And that introduced me to the brain through psychology. So I'd been taught very little biology at school. I discovered the brain through psychology. And it was, in fact, my father who suggested that if I was interested in the brain, I should study medicine because it would give me a broad horizon. He wasn't a man who often gave fatherly advice, but as it turns out, that was a very good piece of advice because I was fascinated by medicine and have very much enjoyed working as a doctor. So my working career has been as a neurologist, and I've always enjoyed writing. And along the way, I have written about aspects of neurology which particularly intrigue me. I guess the puzzle which in a way drew me into neurology in the first place was the puzzle of the relationship between the mind and the brain. How does what passes through our mind relates to the events occurring in our brain? And that fascination gave rise to my first book, which was called Consciousness, a User's Guide. Then I wrote a book called A Portrait of the Brain, which is a kind of introduction to the brain, level by level, from atom up to psyche, with a case history at each level of description. So that really reflected my working life as a neurologist. And then over the last 20 years, gosh, it seems shorter than that, but it has been 20 years, I've become very interested in the imagination and specifically in imagery, and in a group of folk who seem to lack imagery, who we've described as being aphantasic, and people with very vivid imagery who we've described as being hyperphantasic. And my interest in imagination, partly as a kind of defining feature of the human mind. We live so much of our lives in our heads. We're highly imaginative creatures. So that interest in imagination as a defining human capacity and my more specific research interest in imagery came together in my recent book, The Shape of Things Unseen, A New Science of Imagination. So there's a thumbnail sketch.
That's exciting. And I think we will come back to The Shape of Things Unseen because there's so much there. But if we could go back to your previous book, which was A Consciousness, A User's Guide, and then probably I'm trying to figure out what was it since then that has changed? Because obviously there's some excitement about this new book. And what made you want to write this new book now? Because you're coming out with new stuff and that's going to be exciting.
Yeah. So, as I was saying, my initial fascination with neurology stemmed from the problem of consciousness, the mind-brain problem. So, fascinating, complicated things happen within our brains, and somehow they give rise to our inner lives, to our experience from moment to moment. My experience now of seeing you in India on my screen, and I was intrigued by this relationship. How is it? How can it be that goings on within our brains give rise to our experiences? And that's the problem of consciousness. It's an ancient problem, a very worthy problem. It's a very, very difficult problem, and I guess it's not a problem, the answer to which is going to tell us about the essence of humanity, because I think consciousness is widely shared in the animal kingdom. So there's debate about how widely shared it is, but I would be pretty confident that we are not the only creatures who are conscious. Another interest I've had over the years has been in what is the defining mark of man, if you like, or man and woman. What's distinctive about the human mind? And I think one strong candidate for the most distinctive feature of the human mind is our capacity to detach ourselves from the here and now, recollect the past, anticipate the future, enter the virtual worlds that are created by artists and by scientists, and of course to create those virtual worlds ourselves. And that capacity really is imagination. And so in this recent book, I've been trying to, first of all, get a feel for what the imagination is, how it enters our lives from moment to moment, as I think it does, how it contributes to creativity, how it contributes to our cultural existence. But I also wanted to learn about and communicate what we know about the science of imagination. So really the new book focuses on what I think is the most distinctive human cognitive capacity, our ability to detach ourselves from the here and now. And I think that capacity underlies our existence as cultural creatures, which we quintessentially are.
Right. And I assume that as we move through in this conversation, we will probably try to talk a little bit more about the shape of things unseen. But before we get into those aspects of imagination, could you first of all break down for our listeners in a more simpler way the different faculties of the brain and what they actually do? Because I assume as we move on, we're going to be talking casually about those parts. So let's take that out of the equation first, and then we can go smoothly through the conversation.
Yeah. So, I mean, clearly, our brains receive information from the world constantly. That tends to get called sensation, and we act on the world by moving. That involves motor control. So there are sensory regions in the brain and motor regions in the brain, and those were the regions that were relatively well understood and explored by the time I came into neurology about 40 years ago. But as well as receiving information and acting on the world, we do a lot of thinking. So our cognition is our ability broadly to acquire knowledge of the world, store that knowledge and use that knowledge, and it tends to get broken down into a number of subcomponents by psychologists, neuropsychologists, neurologists. So just running through the main elements, the first, I guess, is consciousness. So we have to be awake and alert to undertake cognition of any kind. Then we have to be able to focus our mental energies. That's attention. We have to be able to acquire and store information with the help of memory, which is a central component of cognition. At the moment, I'm using language, which is another vital module of cognition. Executive function tends to be distinguished as a module. So this is really the ability to organize our thought and behavior, and often a visuospatial module is distinguished, because actually quite a lot of the brain, of the thinking brain, is occupied with making sense of visual information, but of course information coming from the other senses as well. And then praxis. Praxis refers to the kind of thinking that goes into learning how to perform skilled movements. remembering how to perform skilled movements, and then programming them. So consciousness, attention, memory, language, executive function, visuospatial ability, and praxis. Those are the kind of classically recognized modules of cognition, and they're to some extent independent of one another. They're, of course, interacting all the time in real life, but one of the interesting things about the brain and about neuropsychology is that you can, to some extent, carve cognition at its seams. So you can, for example, lose language or lose memory or lose aspects of praxis while the rest of your cognitive ability remains intact.
Right. And thank you for that. When it comes to imagination, and coming straight to what we want to talk about today, probably this is something that I have in my mind, and I've always wondered, so probably you're the right person to ask. When we talk about imagination, is it necessary that imagination gets connected to some form of art or talent or skill that can be manifested in the form of art? Because there are some people who may not be artistic or musically minded, but that doesn't mean that they do not have imagination. But in the world out there, that's how we tend to think about it. And is there something that you have to say about this?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So imagination, it's interesting, isn't it, that imagination doesn't figure on the list that I just gave you of cognitive abilities. So it isn't regarded as one of the classical modules of cognition, if you like, one of the classical building blocks of cognition. And I think that's because it actually draws on several of them. Imagination is not a term of science, and it has a number of senses, which it's quite important to try and distinguish, I think. So one sense has to do with what you might call sensory imagery. So if I ask you to imagine a tree, I'm asking you to call to mind something in the world which isn't present before you now. Actually, I can see one in the garden, but you may not be able to. So most of us have a mind's eye, and in our mind's eye we can visualize the look of a tree. Many of us can imagine the sound of thunder or the feel of velvet. Some of us can imagine the smell of a rose or the taste of curry. So in all those cases, we are using our brain to experience something in the world in its absence. And I think that's a perfectly legitimate sense in which we use the word imagine and the term imagination, but it's specifically applying to this kind of sensory or quasi-sensory, semi-sensory experience of things in their absence. In psychology, that's sometimes been called reproductive imagination, because you're reproducing the features of things in their absence. And that mental act isn't a particularly creative one. I mean, it is in a sense creative, maybe we'll come back to that, but it's not, you're not creating something brand new, as we do in acts of creative imagination. So that's one sense of imagination, to do with the sensory imagination. A rather different sense has to do with creativity, with bringing into the world things that are both new and useful, reconceiving the world, reconfiguring the kind of imagination that a novelist is using when he writes a novel, but also, I would argue, the kind of imagination that Einstein was using when he conceived the theory of relativity. So I don't think imagination in this creative sense is restricted to the arts. I think it's engaged in the sciences. It's also engaged in technology. So when somebody creates a new tool, when our ancestors first began to use devised stone tools, they were also employing imagination. Now, it's interesting to ask why we use the same word to refer to the ability to visualize things in their absence and the ability to create things which are both new and useful. It's not, I don't think, entirely obvious why we use the same term, but I guess it's because many creative people do use sensory imagery in their creative works. So Einstein, to take his example again, for example, was a famously visual thinker. He said he very rarely used words in his creative thought. He tended to think much more in images. But I don't think that imagery is indispensable for creative work. And one of the reasons I'm doubtful about that is that the people with aphantasia with whom we have been working are often creative and productive in the absence of sensory imagery. So, for example, Ed Catmull, the past president of Pixar Disney, who won the Turing Prize for his inventions in computer animation, lacks sensory imagery, but has nevertheless clearly been a very productive and imaginative person. So I think there are these, and I should say the second sense of imagination is sometimes called productive imagination. So there's a contrast between the reproductive and the productive forms of imagination.
Right. Interestingly, you mentioned Einstein, and he did visualize most of what his work then turned out to be. But on the other end, like you said, you had Paul Dirac, who came up with antimatter. And famously, he was somebody who probably was not able to visualize, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but he did come up with, I think it was the single magnetic pole and antimatter, which are equally important. And you just mentioned that whether or whether not a person is able to first in their mind's eye visualize and then produce, there seems to be something more interesting here, because the results tend to be the same. Or has your research said, and I want to come to aphantasia cases a little bit later, but does your result say that there is the number of people that have produced work, for example, either in science or in literature, there tends to be a percentage of people that visualize? Or have you seen that it's pretty much equal?
So I don't know that I can really give a sort of quantitative answer to that question. What we have found is that people with aphantasia appear to be a little bit more likely to be working in the sciences, maths, IT. So it may be that that the lack of sensory imagery biases you a little away from traditionally creative arts and towards STEM subjects, whereas if you have very vivid imagery, that may nudge you in the direction of traditionally creative arts, painting, sculpting, writing novels, and so forth. And I think this perhaps reflects the existence of two rather different ways of thinking about the world, both of which have their merits. So the scientific way is somewhat more abstract, isn't it? More systematic, more factual, whereas the artistic way is more experiential, more narrative. So scientists are trying to explain how things work. They kind of create maps of the world, whereas artists on the whole are trying to evoke experience, to help us to share their experience of the world, their kind of feeling of being. Both legitimate aims, but rather different ones. But I think imagination is involved in both.
Right. And when it comes to imagination, do you look at insight as critical to this process? And is insight a part of imagination, or does it stimulate imagination, or does it come somewhere post that?
Yeah. So the creative process has traditionally been divided into a number of stages, hasn't it? There is a kind of preparatory stage in which you're finding your problem and you're acquiring the skills required to address it. Very different skills, of course, for a novelist and a physicist, but in both cases, it's necessary to acquire those skills and to identify the problem within physics which you want to solve, or the kind of set of experiences for a novelist which you're interested in capturing and conveying. And then typically, creative people will experience a kind of phase of incubation in which the problem which they're dealing with, let's take a scientific problem, for example, kind of knocks around in their brain for a while. They may well get distracted from it at a certain point and think about other things. But then typically there is a moment or a series of moments of illumination or of insight when the creative discovery, the creative realization arrives. And that often happens rather suddenly, of course, on the background of that period of preparation that I described. So certainly insight, illumination are often part of the creative process. And when I was beginning to work on this book, I was wondering whether that idea of insight and illumination was a kind of romantic illusion. But in fact, many of the creative people I spoke to and many of the creative people I've read about describe this, the sense that creative ideas come as if from nowhere, they arrive suddenly. Poets describe poems arriving fully formed. Novelists say that when they're writing, it's often as if they're dictating conversations between their characters. They're hearing them and dictating them rather than coming up with them. And similarly, many scientists describe their discoveries arriving rather suddenly, sometimes coming in dreams, sometimes coming with a suddenness and a sense of certainty, which is really rather startling. So I think what this must speak to is the importance of unconscious processes within the brain that the phase of preparation conduces to, but nevertheless that are not entirely under our control. And one of the things I find exciting writing this book is that I think science is just beginning to make sense of those unconscious processes, which certainly when I started out in neurology were pretty mysterious. And I can give you a few examples of processes of that kind, which science is now beginning to teach us important things about.
Yes, please go ahead.
So I think one nice example is what has been called the resting state activity of the brain. So maybe a little background in case listeners are not familiar with this kind of work, but essentially brain is a bit like muscle. So if you use a region of brain to do a particular task, the blood flow to it will increase, and it's possible to visualize that increase in blood flow using techniques of functional imaging like fMRI, functional MRI. And most work looking at the working brain over the last few decades has essentially used that principle. So you might give somebody, a maths problem to solve, and then you scan them while they're solving the maths problem and see which bits of the brain become active while they're solving the maths problem compared to the bits of the brain that are active when they're doing something else, maybe giving you a list of words beginning with a particular letter. So that's the approach that's been used until recently. But over the last 20 years, people have become interested in what goes on in the brain at rest. So in these experiments, you simply ask someone to lie in a scanner and to chill. And it turns out that the brain is really never at rest. It's constantly humming away. And within the brain, there are networks within which activity is synchronized. So a set of regions at the back of the brain that has to do with vision, a set of regions towards the center of the brain that have to do with controlling movement. But it turns out there is also a fascinating set of regions which becomes particularly active in the resting brain. And if you like, it's something of a daydreaming network. So it seems to have to do with recollecting the past and anticipating the future in particular. It's been called the default mode network. So here you have a really rather vivid example of the kind of ceaseless, dynamic, autonomous activity of the brain. And there's a bit of evidence that during creative work, the default mode network is particularly active. Usually, its activity is somewhat opposed, anti-correlated to activity in what's been called the executive network, which is a network we use when we're meeting challenges, essentially. But it seems that during creative work, the executive network and the default mode network are in an unusually harmonious relationship, which might perhaps underlie that experience of flow, which people sometimes enjoy during creativity. So there's one example of the sort of autonomous dynamic activity of the brain, which might help to explain unconscious processes. Another example is a fascinating phenomenon known as replay. So if this work was initially done in animals, mainly in rats, but recently it's been shown that the same principles apply to us. So if you go for a walk in a new environment and you learn a new route, cells in your hippocampus, a part of the brain that's particularly important in memory and navigation, will become active in a certain sequence as you explore the new environment. And it turns out that if you rest afterwards, or if you sleep afterwards, the cells which became active as you explored that new environment in a certain sequence will replay their activity in the same sequence during rest, during sleep, probably mainly unconsciously. But again, another example of an autonomous brain activity which is clearly important to consolidating memory, but which might help to explain what goes on in moments of insight and illumination. Dreams provide another example. Of course, it's an every night experience, isn't it? But extraordinary that our brain composes for us these fascinating, bizarre narratives. And then insight and illumination have specifically been addressed in some work. So it's possible to look at them experimentally. Of course, it's difficult because by its nature, a moment of insight comes relatively rarely, but you can give people problems which can be solved in one of two ways. They can either be solved by sort of painstaking thought, or they can be solved by insight. So let me give you an example. What one word links pine, tree, and source? So occasionally the word apple will pop into somebody's mind, pineapple,
Yeah.
apple sauce, apple tree. But more often people have to think about it and kind of try alternative options. And it turns out that when apple pops into the mind, there is a kind of distinctive neural signature in the brain. You see a burst of high frequency activity coming, interestingly, from the right temporal lobe. The left temporal lobe is where we do most of our language work, but in the right temporal lobe, you have a relatively fluid, loose representation of meaning, of just the kind that might be helpful when you're trying to solve that sort of remote associate task. So we certainly don't have a full understanding of what happens in moments of insight and illumination, but I think science is edging towards an understanding. And certainly, as I was researching this book, I felt that the brain had become a much more conducive home for creativity than it seemed to be 30 or 40 years ago when I began training in neurology, and in a sense a more sort of comfortable and conducive home for the human self for that same reason.
Very interesting. And you mentioned these new developments in what and how we are thinking about these processes. Have you also noticed, or is it even relevant as an individual moves through life and grows older compared to an infant and then a child? Do these processes evolve in a particular way? And is it in some way limited or connected to maybe injury, maybe trauma, where you feel that in certain cases it's picked up? And maybe I'm just leading into aphantasia that I want you to explain to me, because that is something that, in spite of me reading a lot about consciousness, I wasn't aware of this particular term or what happened. So I'm sure it's going to be very interesting for our listeners to hear. How did you come up with this? What was the insight, to use a better word, that got you here? And I did not know that there were so many people all over the world who actually, after listening to you or reading your book or figuring out about your work, realized that this was the case. So I think this is going to be a perfect platform to people listening who may just want to know more about this.
Yes, no, surely. So perhaps I'll start with aphantasia, and then we can come back to the developmental question later, if you like, though they're linked. So I hadn't encountered people who lacked imagery at all until about 20 years ago, when a patient was referred to me who had specifically lost the ability to visualize. So he was a delightful man in his mid-60s who, following a cardiac procedure, a coronary angioplasty, had realized that he'd lost his previously very vivid mind's eye. So he used to get himself to sleep by visualizing faces of friends and family or places he'd been. He had very vivid visual dreams. If he read a novel, he would enter a visual world. If he lost his keys, he said he'd be able to visualize where he'd put them. And all those forms of imagery abruptly disappeared. And I thought this was a very intriguing symptom, and worked with him for some time to try to understand what had happened. He gave such a compelling account of a change, pervasive change in his experience, that I was sure that something had happened. His cognitive performance was really very good. Except, of course, that he performed as you'd expect at floor when you gave him a vividness of visual imagery questionnaire. So if I ask you to imagine the sun rising above the horizon into a misty sky, most people will have a kind of hazy image. of it. Some people will say that they have a very vivid image, as vivid as if they were really seeing it. A few people say that they don't see anything at all, they just know about it. And that was the case with this patient. Previously, he would have been able to visualize this vividly. Now he just knew that he was thinking about the sun rising. He couldn't see it at all. And we went on to do a brain imaging study in his case and showed that when he tried to visualize, whereas most of us activate visual regions of the brain when we try to when we visualize things in their absence, he could no longer do so. So that seemed to be a neural correlate for the change he described in his experience. So this was a case of acquired loss of the mind's eye. He previously had a fully working mind's eye and he had lost it. And the story is that we wrote a scientific paper about his case. I didn't expect it to lead to too much more discussion, but it was picked up by an American science journalist, Carl Zimmer, who wrote an article in Discover magazine. And then over the course of the next few years, I was contacted by a trickle of people, eventually I think 21, who said, this description really resonates with me, except that I've never been able to see things in my mind's eye. I've always recognized that there's something, or for a long time I've recognized there's something a little different about me. When other people describe last year's holiday, they seem to be having a visual experience which I lack. And we thought that it was worth describing what these folk were telling us, because they seem to be giving quite a consistent description. I should say that we sent them all the Vividness of Visual Imagery questionnaire, and they scored 16 over 80, which is the lowest possible score, indicating that they were just thinking about the things they were asked to visualize, not seeing them at all. And we felt that this phenomenon deserved a name. It had been described previously in the neurological literature, but using rather unwieldy terms like visual irreminiscence or defective revisualization. So I consulted a colleague who'd studied classics at university, and he suggested that we borrow Aristotle's term for the mind's eye, which is phantasia, and tag an A on at the end. So that was how the term aphantasia was born. And words are powerful things. This word proved popular. And since 2015, when we coined the term, I've had about 20,000 people get in touch, most of them at this very low end of the spectrum with aphantasia, but some at the very high end of the spectrum with what we've called hyperphantasia. So people for whom imagery is as vivid as real seeing. The great majority of these folk, and they probably constitute about 4% of the population, have lifelong aphantasia. So they've never been able, as far as they can remember, never been able to visualize in their mind's eye. And this often applies to other senses too. So if you have visual aphantasia, it's quite likely that you lack auditory imagery, you lack a mind's ear, you find it difficult to imagine the feel of velvet at your fingertip. So that's the story of how the terms aphantasia and hyperphantasia came about. And I should say, I was going to go on to say that while most of these folk, 4% of the population, have lifelong aphantasia, there's a small number of people who lose imagery over the course of their lives, often because for neurological reasons, a stroke, a brain injury, an episode of meningitis, sometimes for psychological or psychiatric reasons, so depression, psychosis, depersonalization disorder can give rise to aphantasia.
Yes, and it's amazing when you talk about these particular cases. Something that I was initially thinking about was, how come we've not realized this all this time? Because there has been so much of research effort gone into probably consciousness. And to an extent, do you think that the study of imagination or visual imagination, like you said, probably somewhere was not able to get a label or a tag to fit into this sequence? Like you mentioned at the very beginning of this interview, you listed 5, but we as well did not list imagination. Now, since you're talking about it, there seems to be a scientific process that can be applied.
Yeah, I mean, it is very interesting, isn't it, that this topic was neglected. There's been a lot of research on visual imagery, but it's tended to focus on people with average imagery abilities. Maybe that is partly because psychology, at least for a period, tended not to focus on individual differences. It tended to focus on the kind of the typical case, and extreme data would often be discarded because it would seem unrepresentative for mysterious reasons. I think recently people have become increasingly interested in individual differences, and I guess one implication of this work and other related work is that our inner lives differ greatly to a surprising degree. But I should say that although the topics of aphantasia and hyperphantasia had been neglected up until now, 100 years ago, Francis Galton, who was the first person to devise a questionnaire to try to measure the vividness of visual imagery, did recognize that there were people whose power of visualization was zero, as he put it. So he was aware of that. And then there was an odd neglect of the topic. I suppose at the start of the 20th century, experience generally got a rather bad name scientifically. So the behaviorist movement argued that our inner lives, our experience, was not a fit subject for scientific study, so suggested that there should be a focus on behavior. And then more recently, folk like Stephen Coslin, who did wonderful work on imagery towards the end of the last century, were, I think, focusing on the typical case, as I've said. I just wonder whether I had sort of the good luck to spot this, because I'm a doctor, so I'm quite used to dealing with extremes, and I'm kind of interested in cases that fall well away from the norm. But yeah, for whatever reason, it had been neglected, and it's now come into focus. And certainly, I think having a term to describe something is useful. It's a big help to have a handle.
Right. And an individual with aphantasia, like you mentioned earlier, is this person able to describe something that they do not see but they know? So where does memory come in? Because I may not be able to visualize what you've asked me, but somehow I store this knowledge somewhere. I may not know where it is coming from.
Yeah.
But I know it.
Yeah. So I guess something that should be explained early on about aphantasia is that although it makes a big difference to people's inner lives, it makes surprisingly little difference to performance. So people with aphantasia get along just fine in the great majority of respects, and they can often give good visual descriptions, and they tend to be pretty good at answering what have been called high imagery questions. So if I ask you to tell me which is darker, the green of grass or the green of a pine tree, if you have imagery, you're quite likely to visualize the two and then give the answer having made a visual comparison. People like MX, my original patient, and people with aphantasia, lifelong aphantasia, can generally answer that question without any trouble. And if you ask them how they do it, they say, well, I just know. Can't see anything in my mind's eye. I just know. So there's an interesting question as to why that is. Is it that knowledge is somehow coded verbally? Or is it that people with aphantasia have what one might call unconscious imagery, which they can draw on when they're answering questions like that? And there are a number of reasons for thinking they might have something like unconscious imagery. One is that they recognize things fine, by and large. So their brain must have a kind of stored knowledge of what things look like to be able to match the representation to what they're looking at in the world to enable them to recognize. And then actually, subjectively, people often describe something along these lines. So it seems that for quite a lot of people with aphantasia, there's a kind of tip of the tongue phenomenon. They say it's as if the image was almost there. I just can't quite get to it. It's just out of reach. So it's as if they were activating some information in their brain, but it's somehow not strong enough or not sufficiently widely distributed in the brain to give rise to a conscious experience. And actually, there have been some brain imaging studies of aphantasia over the last couple of years, which again tend to point in that direction. So the differences in brain activation between people with aphantasia and people with imagery, when they try to visualize, are not huge. There are differences, but it looks as if they have to do more with connections within the brain, the strength of connections within the brain, rather than reflecting the complete absence of visual representations in people with aphantasia.
Yeah. And when you spoke about recollecting this, I'm sure I'm not sure, but you're aware of Rupert Sheldrake's work when it comes to morphic resonance. And he talks about a collective memory. You spoke about unconscious memory. Uh, he speaks about a collective memory that probably is shared at a deeper level, may not be as far as aspects or tasks are concerned that are so specific, obviously, but that could be one of the roots, or there could be something interesting there that gets passed on over generations.
Yeah.
Do you think that matters in this case?
That's an interesting idea. I mean, I know of Rupert Sheldrake, but I haven't read him properly. I guess that I would have difficulty with the idea of a collective memory that somehow bypassed the brain, but if the idea were that it could be transmitted through the brain, then that seems very plausible to me. I think we do, in some senses, have inherited knowledge of the world. So I'd agree with that. Yeah.
Right. And for people who are listening to this, I'm sure a lot of them are probably testing it out right now as we speak, and they're trying to figure this out. So, do you have any ABC, or it's the age of listicles these days. So 1, 2, 3, 4, test yourself, and you can figure out on a spectrum. And is there a spectrum actually? Are you just aphantasia? Because we'll come to hyper later, but is there it's just A or B, and how
No,
do we know it?
There absolutely is a spectrum, and I had something in the back of my mind at the end of our last exchange, which I'll come back to, which is, or perhaps I'll mention it now, if I may, before I come to the spectrum question. We were discussing what impact aphantasia was making, and I was explaining that it makes much less than you might expect it to, and that people with aphantasia can often give very good visual descriptions of things, even though they can't see them in their mind's eye. There is one respect in which memory does appear to be affected by aphantasia, which I think is really interesting, and this is autobiographical memory. So most of us, when we recollect episodes from our personal past, can to some extent re-experience them, relive them, see the beach that we spent that day at the seaside on. People with aphantasia can't do that, and their autobiographical memory seems to be relatively thin by comparison with those of us with imagery, more factual, less experiential. So that was just a footnote to what I was saying earlier. On the spectrum question and the ABC question, yeah, I wouldn't want people to get scared about their imagery abilities. I think it's quite easy when you focus on your visualization to find it hard to pin an image down. It's quite an elusive, quite an evanescent sort of experience. So if you're wondering about your imagery ability, give yourself a little time to observe yourself. But a very simple test is, say, imagine an apple. To call an apple to mind. Imagine that you're holding it by its stalk. What color is it? Is it still or is it spinning? Now, if you can give a ready answer to those questions, it's very likely that you're seeing it. It'll be green or it'll be red. It'll be still or it'll be moving. It'll have changing reflections on its skin or it won't. If you're aphantasic, those questions don't really make sense. You just think about an apple. You don't see it at all. And absolutely, there is a spectrum. I'll come clean. I'm bang in the middle of the spectrum. I'm a very average imager. So I can call images to mind, but they're not especially vivid, especially detailed, especially rich. I generally don't have any difficulty in distinguishing whether I imagined something or whether it actually happened, which can be a problem with people with hyperphantasia with very, very vivid imagery. The scale, which I mentioned earlier, the vividness of visual imagery scale, allows you a score between 1 and 5 for each of 16 images which you're asked to call to mind. And if you give yourself a score of 1, that means you don't see anything, you're just thinking about it. So you're just thinking about that sun rising into a hazy sky. Whereas if you give yourself a score of 5 over 5, that implies that the image is as vivid as if you were really seeing it. And getting on for 10% of the population say that their imagery is at least sometimes of that kind. And then there are the 3 intermediate scores. I think from personal experience and from talking to people, imagery vividness often fluctuates to some extent in the normal way of things. So if you've recently seen something, you're likely to be able to visualize it more vividly than if you haven't seen it for a while. And I think mood and energy level can have an effect. So there are times when I'm feeling kind of enthusiastic and energetic, and I find I can visualize things more vividly than when I'm feeling tired and out of sorts.
Right. And thank you for that clarification. Earlier, you did mention that people with aphantasia tend to probably excel at certain tasks. And you just mentioned about the 16 question or an online test, what you can do. Is it a possibility, or is it even right to consider that as a competency and then put it somewhere into a psychometric? And I'm getting towards job suitability, because this then becomes very clear as whether the person is going to be able to perform a particular task or not, like any other competency or behavior that we have. Have we reached that stage where we're able to define this definitively and then make a decision?
I feel shy about that development at the moment. I think it's a bit early. Statistically, from our data, at least our initial data, it does seem that, as I mentioned earlier, if you're aphantasic, you're a little bit more likely to be working in STEM subjects, and if you're hyperphantasic, you're a little bit more likely to be working in creative trades. But one of the nice surprises from our work was that really quite a large number of aphantasic artists got in touch with us. So these are people who say they have no mind's eye, but they love the visual world. And if anything, their aphantasia often spurs them on in their work, because if you can't see things in your mind's eye and you want to kind of celebrate them, to represent them, you have to put them down on paper or to sculpt them. So our initial expectation, or my initial expectation certainly, which was that people with aphantasia probably wouldn't be too interested in the visual world, is defeated by these folk. So although there is a trend towards STEM, it's certainly not always the case that people with aphantasia are working in those areas. So I would regard imagery vividness as one small piece in the huge jigsaw that constitutes our psychological makeup. And I don't think I'd want a vividness questionnaire to be used to make decisions about people's job suitability at this stage.
Right. And you also spoke about flow state. So I think the natural next question would be, when it comes to flow state, everybody creative, or I'm sure you don't have to be creative to get into a flow state, because it could just be something that you like doing. And for a lot of people, just exercising or running or working in a gym on their own is a flow state. But I want to try to ask you, because this is something that I do, and I'm wondering, or I was wondering, what is this even connected? Because if I'm either on a discussion or I'm having a serious conversation and I'm trying to declutter a problem or something at work, I tend to subconsciously, without really knowing it, have a pen and then start jotting down while it's going on. I don't realize. But by the end of that meeting, I've got this geometric design that's very symmetrical. And I'm trying to understand. I've looked back at my diary and I found that there are these pages of designs. And I've always wondered whether is that a way of a person or somebody trying to put a little bit of structure into what's happening, or do some people think or need support while thinking so that they do or perform some task? And because sometimes just sitting down, I get the flow state, but I'm trying to get out to the other end. Is there anything that you could throw light on here?
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it sounds as if you're drawing mind maps, which can certainly be very helpful, though I think people would vary in the degree to which they find them helpful. I'm interested in what you say about the kind of value of having a page in front of you, and that reminds me about one of the creative aphantasic folk who we come across. So Glenn Keane is a Disney animator. Ed Catmull, the past president of Pixar, regards him as one of the best animators of his generation. I think he was responsible for many of the images in The Little Mermaid. And he says that when he begins to draw, he has no visual image, no visual preconception of what he's going to put down. He, of course, knows what the subject is. He knows what kind of thing he wants to do. But it isn't until his pen's on the page that an image appears. And he often does quite a lot of scribbling and then rubbing out. And gradually the kind of image builds. And it's rather as if he were using the page as his mind's eye. So there's a kind of dialogue between his intentions and the image that's being constructed in front of him. And I'm sure that something of that kind will be true for just about all of us in whatever trade we're working. We never work things out fully in our minds initially, or very rarely do. Much more often there's a kind of exchange between our intention, the ideas we may have in the background, and the ideas as they appear kind of fully articulated in words or in images on the page before us. So this, again, I mean, it reminds one, doesn't it, of thoughts about extended cognition. One of the we rely on, to some extent, outsourcing our cognition. We use the memory of our computer or the page that we're writing on to aid us, and we'd find it hard to do without them. So I guess that you're using that page to build up a mind map somewhat along those lines. Though it sounds in your case as if you may do that rather unconsciously.
Absolutely, and I think I can understand with what you just said about the animator who is not sure about what that animation is going to turn out, but you have a vivid image of it. And I just want to connect language, because you mentioned language as the other part that was an important cog here. So one is the visualization. Now, how do we use language in a similar way, or do we use language in a similar way? So what I'm trying to get at is, if I'm an animator and I do not know what I'm going to be penning down, but something beautiful comes up, this conversation that we're having as well is, I've not prepared for this. And there are different people. I could have had a questionnaire and prepared, but I prefer to keep going because I don't know what I'm going to ask you next.
Yeah.
And is there a connection in that same mindset that for some people you want to go with that, what comes up next and see where it takes you? And obviously, some people want to have a more structured approach to what comes next. Yeah.
I mean, I guess that's to some extent a question of personality, isn't it? And how willing you are to kind of wing it, to see how things fly. But clearly there are some instances in which we kind of rehearse what we're about to say carefully ahead of time, and other occasions on which we say what comes into our mind. The question, how do I know what I'm going to say until I've said it, comes to mind. Linked to the, I was reminded as you were speaking by links to the aphantasia, hyperphantasia dimension. So some people with hyperphantasia say that while they are speaking, or while someone is speaking to them, they automatically visualize. So if a tree or an apple is mentioned, they will automatically see it in their mind's eye. Whereas this is clearly not the case for people with aphantasia. I think it was Aquinas, the medieval philosopher, who said that when you're trying to persuade someone of something, you're essentially implanting images or transferring images from your mind into theirs. So he was clearly a visualizer.
Right. That was the first line in your book, in fact, when you spoke about passing on messages from one mind to the other.
First line in the Shape of Things Unseen book.
Yes. There was a quote on the first page that spoke about just what you spoke about.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Okay. So the opening quotation is by Picasso. Everything you can imagine is real.
Yeah.
Which I like because it's it's paradoxical, isn't it? We contrast the real and the imagined, but I think there are a number of senses in which it's true. One is that our imagination does have a material, physical, biological basis. When we imagine in the various senses we've been talking about, things are happening in our brains, so it's real in that sense. And then it's real in our experience. If I imagine an apple, something real is happening in my inner life. And of course, in creative imagination, we often have ideas which we then realize. So, I mean, inspirational politicians have ideas about the ways things ought to be, and then they bring them about. So I think it's true in a number of senses.
Yeah, absolutely. Now coming to the other end, and we talk about we spoke about Aphantasia and the other end of it, where you say there is hyperactivity, or does that mean that your cognitive ability to visualize is heightened at different times, depends on the stimulation? And can you give us an example of a person like this and a real story that we can then try to understand?
Yeah, so people with hyperphantasia are people who say that at least some of the time, sometimes all the time, their imagery is as vivid as if they were really seeing something. Often this applies not just to vision, but to the other senses also. Such folk often engage their imagery frequently, so they find themselves often enjoying a kind of parallel stream of imaginative consciousness alongside their awareness of the real world. They often say that they sometimes have difficulty in remembering whether something really happened or they just imagined it. Occasionally they can be traumatized by imagined experiences. So one of our participants told me that she was once with her children in the car. They were sitting in the back seat, and then they left to go to a class somewhere, and then someone collided very forcibly with the back of her vehicle, and she was then haunted for several weeks, months afterwards by the thought of what would have happened had they still been in the car. So sort of PTSD related to an imagined event. People with hyperphantasia are a bit more likely, as I've said, to be working in traditionally creative trades. There's some evidence that they're more likely to be synesthetic. So that's the experience, for example, of tasting a sound or seeing a letter of the alphabet consistently in a particular color, what's sometimes called the merging of the senses. And I think our best guess at the moment is that people with hyperphantasia have somewhat hyperconnected, overconnected brains, richly connected brains, whereas people with aphantasia have somewhat more thinly connected brains.
And from what I'm hearing, Adam, is there then some connection with, from what you've said, with autism or cases in autism? Because it tends to probably have something similar.
So autism, this is a complicated question, and it's one that keeps coming up. So perhaps something I should say in relation to aphantasia generally is that I don't think aphantasia is just one thing. I think it's a feature of experience which can occur in a number of contexts, and the same is probably true of hyperphantasia. So there's maybe one subgroup of people with aphantasia who have difficulty with face recognition, something we haven't discussed. Another subgroup who have particular difficulties with autobiographical memory. If anything, the autism association is with aphantasia. So you see people with autism seem to be more likely than average to be aphantasic, and people with aphantasia on average have slightly increased autistic traits. But it's not a simple story, because there is a line of thought that autism involves thinking in pictures, curiously, and there are examples of people with autism who seem to be particularly strong visual thinkers. So there's more work to be done to disentangle this, but actually there is quite good just observational evidence that aphantasia and autism are somewhat associated, which in a way makes sense, doesn't it? Because autism traditionally has been regarded as a state in which the brain is somewhat less imaginative than usual.
Right. Now, in all your research that you've done, and obviously with your brain imagery, you mentioned earlier that there are certain times during sleep where there is heightened activity. And two parts to this question is, does this heightened activity all of a sudden come up, or do you get a signal that there is one part of the brain that lights up first, followed by where this activity would then be generated? That's I'm just trying to see whether there's a sequence to that heightened activity.
So a really interesting question. And before I kind of address it directly, it prompts me to say that There is a very interesting story linking, or a story about dreaming and aphantasia. So people with aphantasia lack wakeful imagery, but remarkably, the majority of them dream visually. So people with aphantasia mostly, not always, but mostly know what imagery is like from their dreams. And when people hear that, they often say, that seems a bit mysterious, a bit fishy. But I think it makes a certain amount of neurological sense. So if I ask you to visualize an apple in a psychology experiment, you're having to do something very deliberate, controlled, top-down. You have to make a decision, that's what you want to do, and then you have to remember what an apple looks like and use that knowledge somehow to drive activity in your visual system to give yourself the image of an apple or to generate the image of an apple. Dreaming is probably much more of a bottom-up kind of process. Now, I think there's some debate, a sort of technical debate about quite what the best way to describe dreaming is in these terms, but there is good evidence that dreaming is controlled, at least to some degree, by structures deep in the brain, particularly in the hypothalamus and the upper brain hypothalamus and upper brainstem, regions right at the core of the brain, which control the cycle of sleep and waking, and within sleep control the occurrence of dreaming. And we know that when we dream, the pattern of activation within the brain is distinctive. So areas which are involved in kind of cool cognition, executive function, control, tend to be relatively quiet, whereas areas that are involved in emotion and memory are strongly activated. So my simplistic view of dreaming would be to see it as a kind of bottom-up state driven from the brainstem, involving areas, particularly within the limbic system, these areas concerned with emotion and memory, whereas visualization, wakeful visualization, particularly in a psychology experiment, is a very top-down process. And I think it's those differences, those contrasts, that help to explain why you can lack imagery in one case, but you can experience it in the other.
Right. And I don't know if this probably is the correct question to ask, but in that case, I'm asking because I just don't know. Does everybody dream? And then in the case of aphantasia, do they dream as well? Or are there people out there that do not dream?
So just about everybody, every normal person dreams, in the sense that if you monitor their sleep, there are periods of what's called REM, rapid eye movement sleep. Sleep has a fascinating internal structure. You start awake, you then go down through deepening stages of sleep into a period of deep sleep, slow wave sleep, where all you see when you look at the brainwave recording is monotonous slow waves just occurring a few times per second. That happens about an hour into sleep. And then over the next few minutes, you come up into a state in which brainwave activity looks very much like wakefulness. You see rapid eye movements. You can have signs of autonomic arousal, erections in men. And if you wake someone in that state, they'll report a dream. If you wake them in deep slow wave sleep, people sometimes have some experience to report, but it's not the kind of rich narrative that we experience in a dream. So everyone shows that kind of cycling within sleep, and over the course of a night you have maybe 4 of those cycles. As the night goes on, you have less and less of the deep slow wave sleep and more REM. So that kind of fits with experience. If you're woken at 2 a.m, you probably won't have much in your mind's eye. If you sleep in at the weekend and you wake at 10 o'clock, you're quite likely to have been dreaming. So we all do that, but there are people who remember their dreams much more than others. I'm not sure we altogether know why that is. You probably tend to remember dreams if you come close to wakefulness during them. If we look at people with aphantasia, the majority do report visual dreams, but a substantial minority either report different kinds of dreams. So they say they dream, but it's a narrative dream. They just have a storyline, or they might feel some motion, or they might experience emotions, but they don't see things. And then a certain proportion say they don't recollect dreams at all. And that's the proportion of people reporting either non-visual dreams or no dreams at all is higher among those with aphantasia than among people with typical imagery. But the fact remains, most people with aphantasia dream visually.
Right. And I was just thinking, when you mentioned repetitive dreams, So just a possibility if, and I'm trying to connect it to, maybe totally wrong. Yeah, I'm trying to connect it to deja vu. If there is a person who's continuously dreaming about a particular thing, and then in his awake state it happens, or something similar happens, because when it comes to deja vu, we kind of think that I've felt this before or I've seen
Yeah,
it before.
yeah.
Is it connected? Is it even? Am I
Well,
even
I think
thinking scientifically or totally?
yeah, no. I think that's a very legitimate thought, and I think people have raised that possibility in deja vu research, and I've certainly had that experience. Occasionally, I've had the sense that I'm in a dream, or that I've seen a scene previously in a dream. So I think it may be um, one of the tributaries of deja vu, if you like. Yeah.
So, Adam, it's amazing talking to you, and I think we are at the surface here, and I'm just hoping that after this conversation, there are going to be so many of our listeners who are going to want to keep going. I actually want to keep going, but I have to respect your time as well. I know you're busy. Maybe we can come back and do this again. But before we let you go, Adam, what is keeping you awake at night these days? And when I say that in a positive way, something that you want to move towards as far as your research is concerned, and you know that there's a there out there, but you're not able to capture it. Uh, Visualize it in your terminology. Is there something that you want to really get at that you know is true, but you're trying to figure out a way?
Yeah, I mean, there are many things I'm keen to explore. So, in the context of aphantasia and hyperphantasia specifically, there are lots of fascinating questions. So, one is the question of subtypes. As I've said, I think aphantasia is not one thing. I think it exists. It's a feature of experience existing in several contexts. So, what are the subtypes? Is aphantasia with face recognition problems a different animal to aphantasia with memory problems, a different animal to aphantasia associated with autism, and so forth. And that's quite hard to define those subgroups, but we're in the process of trying to do that. We're building a new research platform, and we're hoping to systematically collect a wide range of data from people with aphantasia and hyperphantasia to explore the subtypes. Another fascinating question concerns genetics, the possibility that there's a genetic basis for imagery vividness. So many people with aphantasia have said that they have first-degree relatives who are also aphantasic. Seems that if you're aphantasic, your first-degree relatives are about 10 times as likely to be aphantasic as one would expect by chance. So I'm working with a geneticist colleague who happens to be aphantasic to try to learn more about that. I'm intrigued by this question of unconscious imagery. So I think brain imaging studies of aphantasia and hyperphantasia are likely to shed further light on that. Is it the case that people with aphantasia are somehow drawing on imagery which is just below the threshold of awareness, but which nevertheless can be informative to them? Then there's the question, which I don't think we've touched on much yet, of whether there are mental health ramifications. So I don't regard aphantasia as a disorder. I think it's an intriguing variation in experience, which probably has advantages as well as disadvantages. One of the advantages may be that it allows you to be a little more present than you can be if you have very vivid imagery. So many people with aphantasia describe moving on from a breakup or a bereavement or a house move more easily than their friends and relations. And at the opposite end of the spectrum, is it the case that hyperphantasia predisposes to PTSD or even to psychosis? So there's quite a wide set of scientific questions that I'd like to explore further, and I'm hoping in a future book to come closer to the experience of people with aphantasia and hyperphantasia. I've really enjoyed the conversations I've had with people at these two extremes. I'm fascinated by the way in which these differences in experience touch a range of areas of people's lives. So I'm hoping in a future book to explore that further.
And just a quick one, because maybe I'm not sure whether I caught that earlier or no, but it's such a beautiful name, Fantasia. And is there a story behind how did you come up with that word or that name? Because it just sounds, it's just a beautiful, it's just a beautiful name.
Well, I'm glad you like it. And on the whole, it's gone down well, and it does have a very precise origin story. I can pinpoint the moment at which the the term was coined to a particular cafe table in Bloomsbury, where I was sitting at tea time one afternoon with my classicist friend David Mitchell, and we were discussing how we might describe this phenomenon. And he said, "Why don't you borrow Aristotle's term for the mind's eye, phantasia, and tag an A on it at the end to denote the absence of the mind's eye?" So it came up through a conversation with an old friend, which is a nice way for a word to come into being.
It's beautiful. And Adam, before we let you go, most of our listeners are in the age group of 12, 14, 16, up to 25, and I'm sure they want to read your book right now, learn more about you. So would you want to tell us, where can they find you? Where is your book going to be available in India? Because post-release, or when I release, I will be putting up some links to this podcast so people can directly connect. But is there something you want to tell people listening, and if they want to hear more about you?
Yeah, so with regard to the book, it'll be available through Amazon, I would guess. I think the audio version is probably a little cheaper than the hardback version. There should be a paperback version sometime early next year, I would think, probably January next year, which will be cheaper than the hardback. If you're interested in hearing presentations along these lines, I've given a number of talks about Aphantasia, one at the Royal Institution in January, and which is now online, and a TEDx talk in London 2 or 3 months ago, which should shortly be coming online. So that's on the topic of the book and related talks. If anyone's particularly interested in the aphantasia topic, our Eyes Mind, with a study through which we've studied aphantasia and hyperphantasia, is called the Eyes Mind study. That came into being in Exeter, where I was working until a few years ago. I recently moved to Edinburgh, and the website is about to be launched in Edinburgh. So you'll find it if you Google Eyes Mind Project or Eyes Mind Study. You'll find it in Exeter, but it's soon going to be transferred across to Edinburgh. It should be released there in the next month or two. And then I mentioned a new research platform, which we're hoping to launch sometime towards the end of this year, which will provide an opportunity for people with extreme imagery, aphantasia or hyperphantasia, to explore their experience through a range of questionnaires and tests, which we hope are going to probe as many as possible of the interesting aspects of these variations in experience.
Right. And thank you so much. Thank you so much for spending this time with us, because it was absolutely engaging. I think we will like to speak to you again. I hope you are up to it, and we will not hound you to come back and speak to us again. But definitely, it was a real pleasure listening to you. I've read your book, by the way, and I encourage everybody listening to this that I think we just touched on about 10% of what is in that book, and I did not want to go through the index of that book, because I have it, and I did not want to open that up in this discussion. But this was something that I think both of us wanted to talk on genuinely, and probably now that our listeners have heard this, they've got to take this from level 10 to the next few levels, and I think it's available in the book. But
I'd be very, very happy to come back to other aspects in a future conversation, if you like, Joachim.
It's been a real pleasure, Adam, and we'll connect again.
Okay, thank you very much. All right.
Thank you.
Bye for now.